everyone. This is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, back after a short between sets break, ready to talk about my first impressions of Aether Drift. So I'm recording this the day after playing in the Aether Drift Early Access Streamer event. For some context on the experience that I have. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So, every color pair except for green-white has an uncommon vehicle. Green-white has a mount instead. If you're in an open lane, you might see several copies of that vehicle. In general, it's pretty good to see a lot of copies of a signpost card, but a deck really doesn't want very many vehicles. There are a lot of vehicles in this set. There are some decks that can use a bunch of vehicles well, but your deck needs to have some special characteristic to be able to use vehicles well. So I kind of just wanted to point out that you don't always want to just grab all of these uncommon vehicles that you're seeing. You kind of want to be pretty careful about how your vehicles are fitting into your strategy, how many of them you have, how you can crew them. They're reasonable cards, but they're not necessarily things that you want a lot of. That said, Guidelight Pathmakers, the blue-white 6-mana vehicle that searches for an artifact and puts it into your hand, is kind of cute in multiples because one of them can find another one if you just need a bunch of 6/5 vigilance creatures, which is like a pretty interesting over-the-top end game. So that's an argument for wanting multiple of those. Also, weirdly, the other vehicle that I've liked having multiple copies of is Thundering Broodwagon, the green-black 6-mana vehicle. This one cycles, so it's a little bit less awkward to have a lot of them. And a lot of what I like about it is just the killing something when it enters. This is 6 mana for a very large, 6/5 reach menace that when it enters destroys something with mana value 4 or less. That's, a very good, you get a lot of value out of that card, and being able to cast it reliably has been nice. The other vehicle that I think I probably wouldn't mind having a lot of is Rocketeer Boost Buggy. This is the Gruul 3-mana vehicle that I think makes a treasure when it attacks. 2-mana vehicle, 2-mana 3/2. When it attacks, make a treasure, and you can exhaust for 3 mana to make it a creature. And because you can just exhaust to make it a creature, you don't have to have creatures to make it work, so I could see playing a lot of them and being happy about it. But I think with a lot of the other vehicles, it's easy to have too much of a good thing if they're even good. I'm not sure that all of them are good, but in general, you really want to be careful about your vehicle count. Some commons that impressed me. So in white, Brightfield Glider, the 1-mana 1/1 Vigilance, Saddle 3 to get +1/+2 in flying when it attacks. Saddle 3 seemed like a lot, but there are 2 different uncommons and a mediocre to bad common that can crew it that cost 2 mana. So if you have some of the creatures that can crew it, some of the 2-drops that can crew it, you can be attacking with a 2-power flyer on turn 2, and from there it ends up being a pretty nice evasive threat that represents a really good clock. So, and then also just if there's a mid-game ground stall, then your little creatures might not be doing anything, and this is a way to have a 1-drop that matters on turn 4 through 6 or whatever. So I think that overperformed a little bit. Saddle 3 is a lot. There was a chance that 1/1 Vigilance wouldn't do much, but it was a relevant card pretty often. Collision Course, the 1-and-a-white removal spell that does X damage, where X is the number of creatures and vehicles you have, or destroy target artifact, played really well. mostly just 2 mana destroy target artifact is very good in this set, and then it has like a backup mode of being able to kill non-artifacts. And Voyager Quick Welder, the 3 mana 2/4 that makes your artifacts cost 1 less, was really impressive. 2/4 for 3 is a pretty good defensive stat line. And Blue White in particular has a lot of like 5 and 6 mana cards that are just way better if you can cast them for 1 less mana. So this makes your like 5 mana 5/4 vehicle that makes a 1/1 flyer, and your 5 mana 3/2 vehicle that draws 2 cards, and your blue white uncommon all just like a lot stronger and more realistic to cast. So that card seemed really impressive. Probably specifically in blue white, but some white black decks could use it. And like the if you don't decrease the cost of very many things, like a 3 mana 2/4 that like lets you play 1 card a turn early, like if you ever just play it into a 4-drop and then it never decrease, or into a 5 mana card on turn 4 and then it doesn't decrease anything else for the rest of the game, that's still a pretty good 3-drop. Relatedly, Hull Drifter, the 5 mana 3/2 crew 3 ETB draw 2 blue creature. I kind of wasn't very optimistic about this before playing. 5 mana draw 2 isn't a very good rate, and crew 3 for a 3/2 flyer didn't seem very impressive. But between like just having an artifact in play being relevant and it being pretty easy to like crew it to trade off with something, so it's like 3/2 is pretty much worth a card, and it's nice that one of the cards is like on the battlefield. You don't need to spend mana to get value out of it, and then like the other 2 in your hand. So it's like probably a little bit better than 5 mana draw 3, and then being able to decrease its cost with Quicksilver or with Voyager Quick Welder. All that combined to like this is better than I expected. There are also some like ways to buy its like draw 2, not necessarily a lot of them, but they exist. So that played better than I thought. Overall, I didn't like blue very much. Maybe it'll grow on me, but my initial impressions weren't very high. Deathless Pilot in black, the 2/2 that crews and saddles as if it had 2 more power, and you can spend 4 mana to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Felt really good in green-black. There were a lot of like good high-rarity vehicles with crew 3 or 4 that this was very, very good at crewing. Some self-mill that like gives it to you for free. Generally did a good amount of work, and then just like being, 2/2 for 2 that you're like very happy to trade with because it gives you like a relevant thing to get back, especially since like as a thing that crews more than 2, it's like worth more than a 2/2 in the late game. I liked that. And then the commons that I was most impressed with were probably the black artifact package of Grim Bauble, the black artifact ETB target creature gets -2/-2, and then for 2 and a black you can sacrifice it to surveil 2. Pact Doll Terror, 3 and a black, 3/4. Whenever an artifact enters, drain your opponent for 1, like they lose life, you gain a life. And Wreckage Wickerfolk, 1 and a black for a 1/3 flyer, ETB surveil 2, also an artifact creature. All 3 of those were really, really good. They play really well together because you're like it's just more cards that trigger your Pact Doll Terror, and like there are affinity cards, there are things that care about having artifacts in play. There's like Start Your Engines and like Wickerfolk, the Wickerfolk and the Pact Doll Terror both enable Start Your Engines really well, and the Pact Doll Terror means that any other effect is also enabling Start Your Engines. So I really liked that shell. It makes me want to like prioritize artifacts in any black deck. And yeah, like all of those felt like cards that I'm going to be happy with in basically any black archetype, not just like blue-black or whatever. In red, Thunderhead Gunner, the 5 mana 4/5 reach that you can discard a card to draw a card once per turn at sorcery speed, lived up to my expectations, which was to say that it played really well. I expect it to be like maybe the second best red common after Lightning Strike, especially since like the little red creatures didn't especially impress me. Like they seemed fine, but none of them like really overperformed in my estimation. Might be a me thing. I might be prone to underrating red aggressive creatures, but I liked the gunner. Also, the blue red discard theme felt pretty legit, and Thunderhead Gunner felt like the best way to enable that. Really good with the 3 mana rare artifact that does good things when you discard. So, very high on Thunderhead Gunner. In green, Broken Wings, reprinted many times, but at its best in this set, 2 and a green, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying was consistently very good. I think I'm just generally going to be happy to play even multiple copies of that in my green decks. Kind of like a destroy evil sort of thing, where it like looks narrow, but then actually just plays as a great removal spell. Migrating Ketradon, the cycling honey mammoth with reach, was fantastic. Obviously, like honey mammoth, 6 mana, 6/6 gain 4 life, like overperformed in Kaladesh, and reach and cycling are both great additions to that card. So really, really into that one. And then Hazard of the Dunes. This is the 4 mana 4/4 reach trample, exhaust 7 to put 3+1/+1 counters on it. I'm not usually very happy with like 4 mana creatures that just like have numbers and combat abilities, but reach is a really big deal. Trample's pretty good. Being able to become huge definitely matters. It gets kind of like bigger than basically everything. 7's like a realistic mana after your 4 mana reach creature stabilizes. Overall, that card felt, it for a kind of card that often doesn't play very well. I felt pretty good about that one. The last comment I want to talk about is Scrap Compactor. 1 mana artifact, 3 tap, deal 3 damage to a creature, 6 tap, or 3 tap sacrifice, deal 3 damage to a creature, 6 tap sacrifice, destroy target creature or vehicle. If this only had one of its abilities, it wouldn't be very good, but being able to, most of the time, kill something at a pretty reasonable rate, and then also being a hard answer to a big thing, in addition to being an artifact, so it has like the synergies with the black artifact stuff. It's counting toward affinity. It's an artifact in your graveyard for stuff that cares about number of creatures and artifacts in your graveyard. It triggers Pactol Terror. All that came together for it feeling like a pretty solid removal spell. So that's the note on. Those are my notes on specific commons. Gameplay around Start Your Engines. People were asking about that and like comparing it to the Phyrexian LB1 mechanic. It's generally felt less like swingy than getting 3 poison against decks that cared about that, but it had some of that like interesting gameplay where there was at least one game where I went considerably out of my way to like avoid letting like a little flyer hit me because I didn't want to turn on my opponent's Start Your Engine card. It feels pretty easy to like make Start Your Engines happen if you care about it. There are a lot of ways to like incidentally deal damage, or a lot of small evasive creatures. Some stuff there's like, you can stop it from happening. Sometimes you can't. And overall, I was pretty happy with it. I think that, a lot of the expensive Start Your Engines cards are good if and only if you also have cheap Start Your Engines cards to get them so that they're working quickly, which I think is kind of the idea, that some decks will lean into it more than others. And it's not very intrusive as far as like an out of the game thing to track. obviously some of that is it's nice that Arena tracks it for you, but it's a lot less like fiddly in terms of, needing to know what each number does than something like Ring Temps You. And also, like, unlike Ring Temps You, just a single card kind of does the whole thing, where, Ring Temps You needs several instances of that to happen, and usually that would happen across different cards that did it once. So as far as like these track something outside of the game mechanics, I think I like the implementation here. I like how it plays. It's a lot less intrusive than like day night, where you have to kind of track this moving thing for the entire game. This just goes one way, and you only have to count it until it's done, and then you don't have to count it more than that. So figured people would ask about it. Those are my thoughts on it at this point. Haunt the Network, which is 3 blue-black sorcery, make 2/1/1 Thopters, and then drain your opponent for life equal to the number of artifacts you control, is my early pick for best uncommon. It was consistently incredible both for and against me. It plays really well with the black uncommon package, or the black common artifact package that I already like. It's very splashable because it's a card that you want to, end the game with, rather than something that you necessarily need to cast on turn 5, though it's nice to cast on turn 5 and then start attacking with the Thopters. It's also really, really, really broken in multiples because, the first one adds to the amount that the second one drains for, and you're like draining for more, and you're making like a bunch of evasive creatures. So, I don't know, watch out for and or don't pass that one. The roads really impressed me. This is a cycle that aesthetically I really didn't like before playing the set. Like, it seemed weird where like some colors care more about vehicles than others, but it's just like this identical uncommon land in like 5 copies of this kind of like boring uncommon land. I kind of would have preferred like a one common that like, if the common choose a color land instead of cycling had the ability to like sacrifice to make a pilot or something, then you might have access to like a similar amount of this effect without needing 5 different cards in the file. Whatever. Or another way to do it would be like the common start your engines land could max speed give you a pilot, or sack to give you a pilot or something. But regardless, they exist and they are very good. It seemed like, the reason that this is here is probably because there are a lot of vehicles in the set. It's hard to like use all of these vehicles. Like in general, a deck wants like 1 to 2 vehicles. So how do you like get enough guys that you can actually use your vehicles if you're playing like 4 or more of them? And the answer is, well, maybe people want like 2 to 3 roads. So we'll just like put a bunch of these things in the set and let people who are playing with vehicles in whatever colors they're playing like get them. And yeah, you end up with vehicles sitting around, and being able to sacrifice a land to crew them is pretty strong. The downside's not very big. Early they come in tapped, and that's usually fine. Late, if you're putting it in your deck, there's a decent chance it comes into play untapped. So I was kind of ignoring them early and then played one because I was like, well, let's see how it is. And then it overperformed for me. Now I think that you should really look to have them if you have vehicles in your deck. In general, splashing felt somewhat difficult. Like, I didn't really, like, I kind of like looked to splash a third color in some of my drafts and didn't really come together or feel worth it. But also, my only trophy yesterday was a 5-color deck, so the fixing's there if you want it, and if you're willing to play some like 3-mana cards to the tap for any color. There are 2 different common 3-mana cards to tap for any color, so 5-color green or whatever is certainly there if you want it and you're willing to work for it. But when you don't want to dedicate your like a 3-drop to color fixing, it felt kind of hard to do for free, I guess. So I like to look at three color groups and try to figure out, like, when every two color pair has a clearly defined archetype, sometimes color like pair A and pair B, or pair A, B, and C combine in really seamless ways into a three color grouping that makes sense. For example, like, oh, blue white is artifacts and blue black is artifacts. Esper would probably be a reasonable artifact deck. Whereas sometimes you have, combinations where there's really no overlap in the three. So I like to look for which three color groups in sets with decent amounts of fixing, which I think this is, despite my previous comments about splashing, where it would make sense to play three colors and what those three color decks might be doing. So Esper, as mentioned, artifacts. Grixis, so this one's weird. Like, the themes in Grixis are theoretically artifact control, I think start your engines aggro, and like discard matters, which don't super obviously have overlap. But when I start thinking about the cards, I think there is actually some overlap where, like, the blue-red discard theme has, like, the 1/4 that deals 1 to your opponent when you discard in red. And so that, like, deal 1 contributes to the, like, start your engines thing in, like, red, black. Like, blue also kind of cares about the starting engines. And you have, like, the incidental drain from, like, Pactstall Terror in black. I think that, like, there's kind of a controlling start your engines, like, value sit there, like, kind of Orzhov style, where you, like, win by pinging your opponent rather than necessarily by attacking, but also maybe attacking with small flyers, and just have, like, a lot of good defensive elements. I'm not exactly sure, like, what to call the deck, but, like, Orzhov style win outside of combat Grixis control kind of makes sense to me here. Naya is just mounts and vehicles. Bant is another one where it's kind of, like, hard to describe, but sort of makes sense. Where, like, blue-green is, like, exhaust ramp, and then blue-white is, like, I think theoretically the stated thing is, like, artifact aggro, but I don't really believe that. Like, it felt more like blue-white's thing was discounting really expensive artifacts. And so the, like, ramp and expensive stuff in blue-green makes sense with the, like, discounted expensive artifacts in blue-white. Green-white's thing is vehicles, which, like, lines up with the vehicles in blue-white. So, like, there's kind of just this, like, big ramp vehicle artifact thing that's, like, present here that all the stuff is working towards. So basically, like, a defensive late game value stuff that's, like, using a bunch of, like, value vehicles and, like, some vehicles matters and ramp type stuff from green. And then Abzan has a decent amount of, like, graveyard plus sacrifice and recursion type stuff happening. And then Temur is simple, it's just exhaust. The unmentioned three color pairs are pairs where nothing was obviously present to me. I feel like there might be something to Mardu, but I don't really, like, try to find anything in Mardu very much most of the time, because usually there's enough pull in those pairs to be aggro that you don't really want to be a three color deck. But I think that some synergies do exist if you wanted to try to build, like, a mid-range or controlling Mardu deck, but it would be kind of weird, I guess. I drafted green-black graveyard and blue-red cycling discard. Both felt very well supported. Not a lot more to say about them other than just like, yeah, there were a lot of cards that contribute to this thing. Feels like if you're drafting a deck that's trying to do the stated thing, you can do the thing pretty reliably. So, yeah, like I said, a little scattered overall, just kind of like my experiences and impressions from playing. So, given the broad nature of the topic, happy to answer any questions, all the annoying questions that people pepper me with while I'm streaming and trying to focus on games that I don't really want to like try to synthesize. If you have any of those left over from yesterday, now would be a good time to ask that kind of stuff. This is, the space for the like, what are the best color combinations? How fast is the format? Type stuff that I still won't be able to answer, but I'm at least willing to entertain. So yeah, as always, I want to direct anyone's attention to patreon.com/drafting archetypes if you're looking to support the podcast. Of course, I've been on a hiatus the last few weeks while we were between sets. Didn't really have anything to talk about. The current set was Foundations. It had been out for long enough that it was no longer available to draft on Arena. But now I'm back to regular streaming, and the podcast will continue as per its usual schedule. During the break, all new patrons, really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Aaron and Ben, for the support. And now let's get to questions. Did max speed payoffs scale with rarity? Well, I wouldn't say that's something I specifically studied, but it seems like it basically has to be yes, in that I know that there are some rares that were really high impact, and I don't think that the commons were super high impact. So yes, max speed definitely, I would say, scales with rarity. Like there's the common cycle that if you have max speed, when they're in your graveyard, you can spend 3 mana and exile them to draw a card. I would say that's a very low impact payoff compared to like Vinwixt, which doubles your draws on 2 mana 0/4, which I would say is a very high payoff. So I would say almost certainly yes, max speed payoffs scale with rarity. The one blue vehicle that draws with exhaust seems really busted to me. Did you get to play with that one at all? I only got to play with it in a deck that had no other exhaust, and it still seemed pretty good. So this is one in a blue for a 3/3 with crew, I think crew 2. And then for 4 mana, you can exhaust, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and whenever you exhaust, you draw a card. So yeah, that card would obviously go crazy with the refueler that lets you exhaust every turn. And any other exhaust. Yes, I think that card's very good. I think exhaust in general is pretty good. I think most of the exhaust stuff plays pretty well on its own, and then if you have like actual synergies, it's even better. The rare 4/2 exhaust for 2 +1/+1 counters that returns from your graveyard to the battlefield untapped whenever you exhaust was incredible. So, and yeah, there's a lot of room for the exhaust stuff to like get better, and like I said, most of the exhaust stuff seemed pretty good just like by itself. So I think exhaust is pretty powerful, just kind of across the board. Clarify: the first copy of roads is better than a basic at no opportunity cost. How many roads until you think about how many mounts vehicles in your deck? Well, I mean, I probably would play 0 roads if I had 0 vehicles. I really doubt 1 road per vehicle is strictly optimal, but as a starting point, it doesn't sound crazy. I don't have a better estimate than 1 road in your deck per vehicle in your deck as like a starting point. I don't expect you to get that many roads but I also don't expect you to play that many vehicles. So, and like not all vehicles are created equal. Like some don't really care about having pilots. There's a ton of wiggle room here, but like if I had 5 vehicles in my deck, I probably wouldn't be unhappy about having 5 roads. Um, oh, how do mounts factor in? I don't know. Count a mount as half a vehicle or something. I really don't know. I think for the most part, it's just like the roads aren't a high priority, but take them, like a land, like over under stuff that's great, over stuff that doesn't really matter, and play the ones you have if you have something to do with the pilots. I really doubt it's actually going to be like a how many roads per how many vehicles kind of thing most of the time. I think you're just like going to want them or you're not, and you're going to have them when you want them, and you're going to play the ones you have. But it's certainly funny to think about the like how many would you play if you just randomly had any number of them. Most backbreaking cards you played against? Well, the aforementioned Exhaust Guy and aforementioned Haunt the Network. The 2 mana green white mount can get kind of crazy if it like starts scaling fast. Loot is crazy. I kind of think I was playing with the crazy cards more than I was playing against them. Why do mounts count for less than vehicles as far as like desire for pilots? Because mounts do something without a pilot and vehicles don't. Where does removal fall in terms of priority? This is so archetype and strategy dependent. I suspect that, as usual, the more I play the set, the more I'm going to like removal as I learn to draft the control decks that use the removal well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that like control decks that use removal well will be the like best performing decks in the format. I suspect that aggro decks will value removal similarly to how they usually do. I think that sorcery speed removal that doesn't kill artifacts has has to contend with the fact that sometimes there's going to be like a big vehicle that it doesn't kill, but you can pair that with like dedicated artifact removal and expect your cards to line up reasonably. So I don't know. I would say the set felt pretty normal in terms of removal. Where does that place the Sin Collector of the set, Gastral Raider, and Malevolent Hermit Division Unit, since those specifically hit instants and sorceries and miss artifacts? Yeah, the Gastral Raider, the 2/1 for 3 that takes an instant or sorcery from your opponent's hand, like look at their hand, make them discard, didn't seem like a card that I would want to put in my deck. I think that it has like a relatively small number of hits in general, and when my opponent cast it against me, it didn't do anything. There's also like the blue cycling target creature gets -3/-0 is like another example of a spell-like effect that card doesn't hit. So yeah, I think that like that thing misses a reasonable enough amount of the time that I don't really like it. As for diversion unit, like that's a 2 mana 2/1 flyer, right? Like I don't think I really care that its ability is not going to be as good as it might be in some sets. Sometimes it'll work, but most of the time I'm just like playing it like on rate as a body. Those are my thoughts on those cards. Black has a 5 mana -6/-6, while red has a 4 mana deal 6. Do those feel balanced? Well, the black one gains 2 life. They're both like I think kind of intended as like the clunky removal slot. Like neither is great, both are fine. You don't want to play a lot of either. It makes more sense to play a lot of the red one than a lot of the black one. Like I think the red one's a little bit better than the black one. Both are mediocre, like low tier playables. Yes, the red one is -6 is deal 6 damage or shatter, and the black one is -6/-6 and gain 2. Obviously, costing less mana and being able to shatter is. Oh, I don't know if it's kill a vehicle or kill an artifact. Either way, yeah, like the red one kills more different things and costs less mana. Black one gains life. They're both fine, but I don't want to like fill my deck with either one of them. Was cycling 2 a reasonable thing to be doing on early turns, or is that weak in the context of the set? I tried playing a deck with a lot of cycling, and that deck was a complete disaster. I think it's like sometimes okay to cycle something, but cycle 2 is nothing like cycling 1. You certainly don't want to like intend to cycle stuff a lot. The cycling 2 that appears on cards, I think, should be viewed as like a small bonus. Certainly never anything like Zendikar, where like plan A is cycle this and sometimes I'll cast it. Like you just can't do that with cycling 2. You have to be there for the text of the card and then, oh, this isn't what I need right now, I'll cycle it. Similarly, you don't want to like cut lands for cycling cards. The cycling, I think, it kind of reads like it's support for the discard matters stuff, but spending 2 mana to trigger your like discard a card thing is pretty bad. So like I would say if you just completely ignore cycling on the cards while drafting and building your deck, but then remember that it's there in gameplay and like do it when you need to or like when it's the best like action to take, you'll probably be pretty well served by that. Like do not draft around an idea that you're going to be cycling your cards, with the exception of cards that cycle for 1 or cards that do something when you cycle them. Did I have experience with Guidelight Matrix? This is the 2 mana ETB draw card, 2 tap to saddle a mount or crew a vehicle. I did play it a tiny bit. It felt pretty clunky. Like, in theory, I like the idea of, like, oh, here's a cantrip artifact that will, like, handle crewing my vehicles for me. In practice, spending 2 mana to, like, crew a vehicle was, like, costly enough that I don't think I ever did it. I think it's, like, okay if you're there primarily for this as, like, an affinity enabler or something, but actually planning to like spend mana to crew your vehicles is not a good way to go about crewing your vehicles. Discussion about Vinwixt with cycling. So I like the deck that I had that was trying to care about cycling had Vinwixt, and my conclusion is that while turning your cycling into draw 2 is pretty cool, spending 2 mana to go up a card while you have an unchecked Vinwixt is a terrible use of your time because you're just drawing 2 cards a turn normally, and you really want to spend your mana to like cast those cards to impact the battlefield rather than just like funneling all of your mana into like more excessive card draw on top of your already excessive card draw. So again, like there are a bunch of playable blue cards that cycle. If you have Vinwixt, some portion of the time you might want to cycle some of them, but I would not in the future allow Vinwixt to trick me into thinking that I'm planning to cycle any of my cards in deck building. How did you feel about defensive combat tricks? With creatures being cast pre-combat to crew vehicles, I thought they might play similarly to how it was in March Machines. I can't say I had a lot of experience playing combat tricks defensively. I can see what you're saying about like it is somewhat more likely that your opponent will be tapped out in combat on your turn, and so like using a combat trick defensively might play a little bit better. That's a coherent thought that I don't think should appreciably impact your like deck building or card evaluation, but tactically in games there will be turns where like, oh, my opponent just played a vehicle, I have this combat trick. It's probably going to be safer than usual to plan to play this defensively, and you can adjust your gameplay accordingly. Would you have ever played a Spell Pierce if you were given one for free? I have no idea. It doesn't seem obviously bad. Like being able to counter vehicles is pretty nice. It's probably still not good, but I'm not sure. Like there are a decent number of like expensive removal spells. Like if you counter like the aforementioned like deal 6 or -6/-6, that's a pretty big tempo swing. And like it's not that hard to hold up 1 mana. People probably aren't going to be playing around it a lot, and there are plenty of like good vehicles that like countering would be a pretty big swing. So I wouldn't write off Spell Pierce entirely, but I'm not sure how it's going to play. Any cool build arounds and notes for building around them? The black-white rare that can sacrifice a creature and surveil and then like makes a zombie when your thing dies. I passed a Bloodghast and then got 2 of those, and I was very sad that I passed the Bloodghast. So I guess pay attention to the fact that it's possible to get those 2 rares together, because if you do, it's really good. Bloodghast seems like kind of hard to use otherwise, though, so I'm not sure what to make of that. Did Curse Cloth wrappings feel like a bomb? No. It felt like a reasonable long game tool. Like, obviously, with very different deck building implications and a slightly different power level than, like, the book, like the 3 to play, 2 tap, draw a card, max speed when you draw a card, mill your opponent for 2. But that kind of card more than a bomb kind of card, like a late game inevitability engine. Incidentally, I was pretty optimistic about the book, like just based on the text of the book. Playing against it, I was playing like a controlling deck against someone who had it, and the max speed is really easy to turn on, and the mill aspect meant that I was basically dead as soon as they cashed that card. So I continue to be pretty optimistic about it. I think that card's pretty good. I think that the mill aspect of it is a lot more real than my initial reading noticed. Like, it's pretty likely that other cards are going to like turn on your max speed so that it'll just be like ready whenever you draw it. And like the combination of mill them for 2 whenever you draw and 2 mana tap draw in like blue, where there's like a lot of other ways to draw, is like just really good at killing people. Aether Siphon is the card in question. Did you have early impressions on the 3 raceways? This is the rare, uncommon, and common cycle of land that like turns on, start your engines, and then have abilities at max speed. The rare taps for 2 at max speed. The uncommon gives haste, and the common rummages. I think that if your deck can afford a colorless land, these are pretty good. Like starting max speed. I mean, it kind of depends on how many other cards in your deck care about max speed, but if you have like a few that are good, like turning on max speed right away is pretty nice. Yeah, the lands all tap for colorless by themselves and enter untapped. I liked having one of the common, like being able to rummage in the late game is kind of nice. In practice, I mean, it's very expensive to use. It like, kind of like it's the kind of thing that you only use if you're in like a legitimate top deck war. So pretty low impact. Like I wouldn't want it without other start your engine stuff unless my mana is very good. I don't know. The Soul Ring one's really hard to evaluate. Like it doesn't give you 2 mana until pretty late. Like you need some reason to expect that you're going to care about getting 2 mana that late. But I feel like those lands are all kind of similar, and they're basically like the main draw is, well, this doesn't hurt me very much, and it starts the engines right away. Oh, common with Vinwix, so the common is drawing two, discarding one is cute. Again, I'm not really looking for ways to spend a ton of mana to go up a card when I have Vinwixed, but it is a little cute. The card or archetype I'm most excited to play next. I mean, I kind of want to just like figure out where I want to play. Like, I suspect that I'm ultimately going to gravitate towards some kind of like multicolor deck with a bunch of good removal. And I guess I'm excited to like get into the details of what that deck looks like. All right. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks for hanging out, everyone. I believe the set comes out on Tuesday. I think that I will try to be on my usual schedule. So, recording the podcast on Wednesday next week. And of course, I'll be diving into archetypes from there. So, welcome back, me. Welcome back, you. Welcome back, listeners. Welcome back, podcast. Good to be back. Looking forward to covering Aether Drift, and I will see you, for whatever that means, next week. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.